Hello, listeners, to another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Beharin.
Greetings, Internet. I'm Jay Goldberg with a brand new microphone.
Yes, and some nice headphones that people can see if they watch the YouTube link of of our thing, which I still encourage people to check out because you don't just have to watch the whole segment. I'm breaking them up now into smaller kind of highlights, if you will, little mini segments of some of the nuggets nuggets that we're dishing.
TikTok, here we come.
TikTok famous. So I was just at an event from MediaTek, a company that probably a number of our listeners listen to, but I know many on the invest side of our listeners don't always track this company because they're not listed on an American exchange. But they're always in the conversation. They come up very regularly when you're looking at mobile markets and obviously smartphone, meaning what I mean by mobile. But there's some interesting changes afoot. They're in an interesting position, sort of similar to Qualcomm, if you will. Very many similarities. But I'm always intrigued by this question because this kind of gets thrown around. So I'm curious on your thoughts. I already think I know what you'll say, but if you were to sort of just summarize your normal thinking of MediaTek, like how would you summarize them or the role they play in the industry in just a brief sentence or two?
MediaTek reminds me of this guy I knew in college who was aggressively boring. His big goal in life is that he wanted to be an actuary, like not just a
Okay.
normal accountant, but an actuary. Like for some reason, it got in his head that he really wanted to be an actuary,
Yeah.
and he could have been an electrical engineer. He's a really smart guy. He could have been like done computer programming, could have done business, been a banker, anything, but he really wanted to be an actuary. And he started doing that right out of college and built himself a little actuary consulting practice, and he makes a really good living. He doesn't get to fly in corporate jets. He doesn't zoom around the world going to fancy conferences. He doesn't make, internet crazy money, but he's consistently made really good money throughout his career. And he has a pretty good life as a result.
Yeah.
And I think MediaTek is very much in the same camp. Like they are a little bit out of mind, like you said. They're listed in Taiwan. They're based in Taiwan. A lot of people here don't think about them. I mean, I had to struggle for years when I was in the street to get people to pay attention to them at all.
Mm.
But they're important and doing pretty well.
Yeah.
So good for them.
I think we were sort of having this perception conversation amongst a number of the analysts at this event, and it wasn't just our perception; it's what you hear also of the industry. That one, they're kind of just the value player, and that has been where they've been, right? I think it's interesting though that to be honest with you, we see them as the value player. How everybody who's been in consumer electronics for any number of history might remember that when DVD players were growing, they were the leading market share SoC in all DVD players, including the premium. So if you were somebody like a company like Zoran, who also made a media processor, and you were building DVD players, MediaTek was the king. Like they were the one. You're like, I got to take share from them. They're dominant. Then through evolution, right, they're going on into smartphones. They are actually in most people's TVs. Probably don't know that, but whether you have a high end to a mid range TV, even low end, you've probably got a MediaTek chip in it. But the point is that when you just look at smartphones, they've sort of been that value competitor, right? They don't have the flagship in that like Qualcomm does, or obviously like Apple, and that really gets the perception. Right? That's just regardless of all the things I just said. That's where people kind of squarely put them as they're the value player. They're not in anything premium, but they're just doing okay, like you said. But they're value.
Yeah, I think for a long time the company has suffered from that perception. People have underestimated them considerably. They look at them as sort of the cheap, the knockoff Qualcomm, right? To be really crude about it, and I think that's grossly unfair. They're immensely capable engineering teams. They have really solid modems. They just have a very different business model and different set of priorities than other companies. And
Yep.
right, I think it's underappreciated how much of China smartphone success, China TV success is built upon what MediaTek provided to that ecosystem.
Yep.
And I mean, that's, pretty staggering. I know. I mean, there's a professor at Harvard at HBS, Willie Shi, who has written an incredible case study on MediaTek and how they enabled not just a few customers, but like thousands of handset companies to grow up in China.
Yep.
And I mean, that's pretty significant impact.
Yep. Yeah, and again, some other places they show up that people may not know. If you own a Kindle e-reader, that's got a MediaTek tablet in it. If you've got a Amazon Echo of any kind, that has a MediaTek product in it. And so, again, it's one of those things where they're interesting because I've followed this company for a really long time, and almost universally, like they'll say, "Oh, hey, we're in that product." They're in Pelotons, for example, and you would have had no idea because they don't go and sing their praises about design wins. It's just a cultural thing that they do, and as much as I think that it's nice and they should do that, it's hard when you don't know, right? You don't see these sort of design wins that they get, and realize that they're actually much more proliferated. But the thing I've always liked about MediaTek, and you hear this, we hear this from our clients who use MediaTek parts, is amongst everybody in the ecosystem, they're one of the most partner friendly companies because they're willing to just do what their partners want and help, like you said, enable them, not be not have this perception of what should be done or what they want to do. They're like, if you want to do that, we're going to work with you to do it. And so they're very partner friendly. And I've always heard that and thought that's kind of an underappreciated aspect of working with MediaTek, is that you get great service along with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I don't know if we want to get too much in their history, but like if you go back to why they exist and why all those smartphone companies were able to come about, is they provided an immense amount of engineering support to, they provide what were called reference designs. Like, here's a blueprint to anyone who could do basic, PCB parts assembly could then go out and build a phone because of what MediaTek provided. And
Yeah.
they weren't they charge for chips. They don't really charge for that reference design service. That's just, another way to think of that is that's customer support.
Yep.
And it was really interesting because once MediaTek really started to get scale, there's a few years there where Qualcomm was kind of worried about them, and Qualcomm tried to go after that market themselves. They had their own set of reference designs, and Qualcomm could just not replicate that service model. Like, Qualcomm is just
Yep.
built differently. They're really good at going after the big engineeringly capable companies.
Yep.
MediaTek was going after all these people who didn't have RF engineers and didn't have, years of experience in building phones, and they provided all that support for them and made that possible.
Yep. So, in a lot of ways, they're up against dynamics that we talked about last week. Nobody's immune to the let's just call it scant growth ahead for the semiconductor industry. It's why you hear a lot of earnings calls that's come out of semiconductor companies right now. Everybody's asking, like, look, where we talked last week, this is cyclical. Everybody's asking, well, where are we at? Right? Are we at the bottom of a trough? Is the trough still going to get lower? Like, when might this cyclical cycle start to rebound? So those are large, big questions. But diversified businesses do best when you do have product cyclicality, and that's why you're seeing so many semiconductor companies want to diversify their business. And so at this particular event that I was at, this analyst event with MediaTek, they came with a very similar story. Yes, we're in mobile, that's our biggest business, but we have other segments that we want to go into and sort of invest in some adjacencies, again, to diversify their business model. Qualcomm has the same thing. Again, everybody doesn't want to be a one-trick pony, and I think that's relevant in this space. But it was interesting because this was the first time, to be honest with you, I've been at many MediaTek analyst events where they talked about two areas that I had not heard them talk about before. One, automotive, and apparently, unbeknownst to me, they've actually been doing some automotive work with a couple of Chinese OEMs, but not to the degree that they have the same solution that covers ADAS and safety and all the elements of powertrain, et cetera. It was just chips here and there, but it's not. Their point was, we're not brand new to automotive, even though we have a new platform. We've done some chips, and the other was enterprise. They've actually identified enterprise ASICs, so not CPU, not GPU, but sort of companion processors, perhaps some networking, right, as a growth area. And to me, I look at those two things because these are themes we've talked about. Yes, we believe semis, content is going to grow in those areas, but they're also two of the richest areas for semiconductors. So I thought it was smart to the degree that we believe they can go and be successful in those areas, but good adjacencies, in my opinion, to start to make investments in.
Yeah, I mean those are the growth areas, right? Mobile, as we've talked about a lot, is pretty fully saturated and slow growing.
Yep.
TVs, probably something similar. IoT, we could spend hours talking about the IoT market, but it's not 50% growth. But two businesses where the whole industry is looking very carefully right now is automotive and ASIC. I don't know if I call it enterprise, but that ASIC service where they're helping other companies build productized chips.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the automotive thing. I've said this for a long time now. Is ADAS, which is the exciting part of the automotive market, is the chip you need for ADAS looks an awful lot like a mobile applications processor. It needs
Mm-hmm.
to be able to handle multiple, sensor signal fusion. It has to do some analog de- decoding essentially. And this time it's not cellular signals; it's lidar, sonar, radar, whatever. And it also has to be able to run lightweight apps. Okay, and it has to be power efficient because it's
Yep.
in an electric vehicle. That's an application processor. That's a Snapdragon or a Dimensity.
Yep.
And so it makes a lot of sense for MediaTek to go after this. They have the part.
Yep. And we talked about this, so this is where I think it'd be good to go a little bit more into China autos and EVs. But again, it's autos is sort of tough, right? This is a long, long cycle. But I have to think that of anybody that we've sort of talked about, MediaTek might be one of the better positioned to go after many of these automotive companies in China who are starting from not from scratch, but really going full into EVs, and also a market that might actually move a little bit quicker in terms of year over year innovation and design than U.S. companies. But I think of anywhere, right? If I believe their automotive story, I believe it more in China than I do a Ford, a GM, some of these American brands, or maybe even to some degree the Toyotas and the Kias of the world.
China is taking over the electric vehicle market, and if you some numbers came out this week that sort of highlighted this. I've been talking about it for a while, but the numbers like surprised even me. Right? They have something like 40% of Europe's EV market right now. Massive. In the last 4 quarters, Brad Setzer on Twitter shared some data. He's an economist. He shared some data. The last 4 quarters, China exported $70 billion in vehicles. Right? They early in 2022 they became a net exporter of cars for
Hmm.
the first time in their history. I mean, it's just and it goes from like 10 billion a year ago to 70 billion in a year. I mean, it's staggering. And that's it's a massive market, and it's almost entirely EVs, and there are a lot of semiconductors that go into those EVs. So
Yep.
anybody who can supply into that is in a good position.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the export one I think is actually really interesting. Through all of these cycles, people have sort of always tried to ask this question like, well, when will China be an exporter like Japan was, like Korea was, right? And bring technologies to a wider market. And again, it's not that their smartphones didn't get out of China. They're obviously Chinese smartphone brands doing very well in Asia, but not into the United States, right? The same way that a Toyota or Kia and Hyundai have. But I'm curious, do you think maybe not necessarily to the U.S., but is this going to be the kind of big export technology opportunity for China?
I think it already is. I think nobody's noticed it yet. Right. I think there's a few key things that they've done. Well, I think there's a few things we have to think about going forward. Right? Did they just was this just a fluke?
Mm,
I don't think so. I think there's something very solid here. One of the big advantages China has in going after this market is they obviously have a large domestic market which is not easy to sell into. But they're, the big U.S. and European companies all have pretty sizable operations in China. But the because they sort of had to start off dependent on the domestic market, which is still a pretty price sensitive market, they've really specialized in low priced EVs. So BYD, which is I think it's the biggest EV maker in China. BYD is now selling an $11,000 electric vehicle. I don't think that's going to play well in the U.S., but it certainly plays well in Europe. Like people like smaller cars in Europe, and for $11,000, I think maybe people in the U.S. would consider it. Now, separate from that, there are going to be geopolitical reasons why none of these cars have been imported into the U.S. yet. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But I also don't think many people in Europe thought that China was going to sell $50 billion of cars to them this year. So who knows?
That is sorry, how many cars do you think the export number reels breaks down to?
I don't know. I don't know if it's $50 billion. I think is the export figure to Europe.
And I think I've seen some statistics. I'm going to completely forget, but it's low double digit percentages, right, of volume. Basically, I know it's higher in China. Like ours is like 5% in the United States is fully electric, but I think it was maybe double digits for a volume.
I know they exported 679,000 electric vehicles last year,
Okay.
which is a pretty sizable. I mean, now to be fair, we're talking about market share of electric vehicles. In the
Yeah, yeah.
grand scheme of all vehicles, it's
Right.
still
Very
pretty
small.
small.
Yeah.
But I think that's 40% of exported EVs in Europe, or imported EVs imported into Europe.
Yeah. That's super super interesting. I'm fascinated, honestly, by your point about the $11,000 EV is just so interesting, and in so many markets, like you look at, and think this is actually where I think it's a little bit kind of really interesting, especially relative to MediaTek, who actually does have a lot of share in smartphones in Europe with the Chinese brands. Is Europe is much more concerned about price, if you will, or price to value than the United States market is. I think that's why we have this weird duopoly between Samsung flagships and iPhones, honestly. But it's not that way in Europe. There's a lot of price discrepancy, and because price optionality makes it is a big deal. Like you could see why auto follows a very similar path. Right, get a great value, great car, fully electric, $10,000-$11,000, like that's a home run for a lot of people in Europe. They're just not as picky the same way I guess U.S. consumers are with some of those dynamics.
Well, there's a few things at play. I mean, the European auto market is just different, right? They for a lot of reasons they want smaller cars. Some of which are just
Yeah,
it's denser,
right,
so parking is harder.
right.
A lot of it is regulatory. There are all kinds of reasons. But you know, Europe has a pretty sizable automotive industry, and I think those companies are now in a pretty uncomfortable position. They Daimler and Volkswagen, Audi all need to really accelerate their shift to EV.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, and that's a long cycle for those companies. But again, right? If you had to venture a guess, how long would it be? This will make my point. Before there's an $11,000 fully electric car in the United States.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't even know I see it on the horizon.
yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, at the if you look at the latest pricing statistics from Tesla, maybe it'll be sooner than we expect. But yeah, it's going to be a while.
Yeah, yeah. But I think again, right, just the way that they can leverage price, manufacturing scale. Again, I have to imagine these cars are. I have no idea, but I have to imagine they're not awful with the technology. Is from all of said features. Again, it's not going to be a luxury EV, but I can't imagine, right? It's terrible. That getting down to that price is impressive.
No, I saw somebody else do a comparison of a few Japanese models versus some of these Chinese EVs. Comparable price points, Japanese internal combustion gasoline engines versus Chinese EV, and the Chinese cars were all nicer. I mean, we're like not luxury leather interiors, but still nicer, more definitely more
Mm.
modern, just looked cleaner. They've all been designed in the last few years. These look pretty appealing.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to take this back to MediaTek because I think there's something deeper going on here that's important. One of my big questions around the shift to EVs is, will we be able to decouple car design and car manufacture the way that we decouple electronics design and manufacture? Will we have an ODM for cars? And I think that exact model probably won't look exactly like that, but I do think there are some pretty fundamental shifts in the way that we're building EVs compared to gasoline engines that are going to really, really shift how the industry works. And one of the results of that will be cheaper cars. And I think this is really, really important for MediaTek because just like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, they went to all these Chinese PCB assemblers and said, "Here, this is how you build a phone." The analog today is they're going to all these big traditional gas engine car companies in China, many of which are state run, and they're exactly as clunky and old fashioned as you'd expect them to be.
Mm.
So they don't necessarily have software chops. You and I talked about this when we talked about automotive a few weeks ago, a few episodes back. Like how are the big car companies going to do software? It's really important. Suddenly it becomes much easier if all the silicon is coming from somebody who's really good at giving you a complete package. Here's the reference design,
Yeah.
right? You can, we'll throw in whatever software. It gets much, much easier when a traditional state-run car company is branching into EV. Now, they don't have semiconductor expertise, but they don't really need a complete set of capabilities because they have someone like MediaTek who's really good at supplying a lot of that engineering support. And I think this could be this is one of those ways in which the shift to EV is going to shift the economics of the auto market.
Yeah.
And
No, it's a great point. In fact, and you using the sort of analogy that they did, where they basically had this very quick to market kind of ODM board for smartphones. Just take the board, slap a brand on it, and go. Is actually an interesting approach that they can take because one of the things they shared at this event was this entire now system, right, covering everything from digital cockpit to ADAS to the cameras to the sensors, right? So they do have that whole package. And I kept thinking to myself, like, this is in line with a lot of things we've talked about before, which is anybody who wants to supply to automotive needs to cover as many bases as possible because they don't want a complex supply chain. They just want a complete solution, this whole, term, a one neck to choke scenario, so that they just want to get as much from one vendor as possible so they can just know it works together, write the software and go. And that's why all these companies are basically doing the same thing, right? If you look at Qualcomm's offering, NXP's offering, and now MediaTek's offering, they're very similar, right? In all the areas that they address because they just want to have that one customer conversation and to some degree get all of that, right, dollar content amount for themselves, share of wallet. But it makes sense, right? You don't want to go CPU somebody else, camera sensor somebody else. Only a handful of companies that actually provide all this, like you said.
yeah, agreed. I think the US automakers are in the process of rethinking their semiconductor strategy. And my sense is they actually aren't looking at doing it that way, that having that one one neck to choke, because their entire history of supply sourcing
Right.
goes against that. They always want to have multiple vendors and they want to play them off each other. And it's a whole complicated thing and they want to be in control. They want to be dependent on anybody. And I think this may be one area that sort of base instinct works against them. And
I think you're totally right.
I think one of the really, I think, poorly understood aspects of what MediaTek did in phones that was really important was it greatly accelerated the time to market.
Yep.
Right before MediaTek came along, Nokia, Motorola, it would take them 10 to 18 months to design a phone. When MediaTek was sort of when that ecosystem was at its height, when there were thousands of vendors in China, you could get a new phone designed in 6 weeks. So to go from 18 months to 6 weeks is massive, a massive shift, right? Because it means you can essentially react to consumer demand trends in almost real time. And again, autos aren't going to be perfect analogy, but I think that by going down this path, it does give the automakers the ability to move much faster.
Yeah.
And and it's something that Tesla does too. That Tesla's really good at that,
Right.
constantly iterating and improving as things goes along. Again, completely anathema to the traditional automakers
Yeah.
who
I
have long
I
product
think
cycles and everything's thought out along.
I think that's the most important point, right? And that again, like even just coming off the last few episodes ago, we were talking about automotive, and I was almost just more convinced there's no way the incumbent auto OEMs will survive the next 15 years, 20 years. Disruption is a process, not an event. And so I think they're going to get disrupted. It's going to take some time. They might not be gone, but I think people have to take a very different approach to this. And that's kind of what we're saying, right? How China's doing it, how Tesla's doing it, how Apple may do it, how Rivian and some of these other brands are doing it, which we talked about might get purchased by other tech companies. But then again, you've got tech companies doing automotive because that's how they're built. That's how they work. That's the world that they know. And it's not the world that, your Fords and your GMs know. I will be curious to see what Toyota and Hyundai do. I mean, I do tend to think that the Japanese and Korean brands could maybe adapt faster, but at the same time, I still don't see it right now in terms of what they're producing.
Yeah, my sense is that the Toyota and Honda, Toyota certainly are really far behind on this. They're kind of resisting it. Kia is a little different. I think Kia has been, they're the newcomer in some senses, so they're moving a lot faster down EV. They have some pretty compelling vehicles, but I think it's going to be a big problem for Toyota and some of the others. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how the U.S. companies react. I mean, again, I'm not an automotive expert, but my guess is there's going to be two responses in the U.S. The big incumbents are going to fight it tooth and nail, including especially with political trade tariff restrictions. And then I think there are going to be others who just say, "Wow, we can't beat the Chinese EV makers on price. Let's accelerate the to the next step function, which is autonomy." Right? And so it's sort of like there'll be one side that wants to just hold on to the past as hard as possible, and the other side that's
Yep.
just going to be like, let's move as fast as possible to the next step because we have an advantage there.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, if this decision by GM to stop supporting CarPlay is any indication, which will be, to be honest with you, an absolute disaster for that car company to not support car. This is not a great indication of their decision making process going forward, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm gonna
Ugh.
bite my lip because I bash the U.S. auto companies more than I should. But yes, I agree with you.
Okay, so within China, we believe MediaTek has a model, and automotive is a good adjacency. Um, Wait to be seen in US. I do think Qualcomm and NXP are competitive there, and obviously Nvidia is not going to give up. Um, so let's talk about the data center side then, and then one last one, which is the category everyone likes to bash, but I at least want to bring it up. So the enterprise. So I again, right? Their commentary is they see this as an opportunity. Global hyperscalers, data center. I again think that China is a reasonable market for them to have some success in with what we'll call a semi-custom ASIC. Um, what's your thoughts on sort of that premise? Like, am I too narrow? Do you think they could get outside of the Chinese hyperscalers, or is it again, yeah, it makes sense for them to start to carve out some opportunity in the China data center market?
So they've had an ASIC business. Now that I think about it, they've had it for a long time, supporting mostly U.S. companies, not necessarily in the data center, but other equipment hardware makers. So it's not a totally alien business to them. I think what they've probably seen is that there is obviously this big move towards everybody rolling their own chips. Broadcom, Marvell, even AMD have talked a lot about that market opportunity. So it makes sense for MediaTek to be in that business. They do have some U.S. customers already, but it's not the big flagship ones you would think of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's probably and that's okay. Like there just so happens there is a whole country with 2,000 chip companies and hundreds of industrial companies all wanting to build their own chips that might need some help.
Yep.
And so I don't know how much they've gotten in the data center in China yet. I don't think Ali uses them, but I certainly it makes sense to all those automotive companies we just talked about are going to want to do this, and so I think MediaTek would be happy to work with the automotive companies that are trying to build their own chips. There are a lot of
Yep.
other industrial companies in China doing the same thing.
Yep.
So yeah, I don't think they I think the logical approach for them is to go after what's closest. But again, they still have the occasional stuff outside of that.
Yeah. So the thing that I think is interesting, honestly, is they do bring a few things to the table that's not that it is our data center plays. Again, not every workflow in data center, and I think that's an okay observation that all these companies we talk about, it's workflow dependent in the data center, but they do have an advantage. They do have some assets that your Broadcoms uh, and your Marvells don't. The two others who you get heard most about custom ASICs in their 5G business, and some of those underlying chips and architectures for 5G. And so I wonder, they've got Wi-Fi as well. Networking is a part of what most switches is Marvell and Broadcom too, but they do have some things that others don't. And so I'm wondering, and that got me thinking. Okay, well, where because you had made a point about MWC, right? That some of these hyperscalers were starting to adopt some of the wireless carriers infrastructure, and so in some of those scenarios, connectivity chips make a big deal, right? You need that elements of connectivity and cellular infrastructure and all some of the back end stuff. And so I just wonder, right? That's the one thing that I kept hearing them say, we've got this, the others don't. I don't know how it all fits, but it is IP and assets that they have that the two competitors who get thrown out in this I don't have.
Yeah, I mean, MediaTek has a real networking business, mostly Wi-Fi and adjacent stuff, not competing with Tomahawk, but
Yeah.
at the sort of low-level Ethernet Wi-Fi level. And some of their customers, some of their ASIC customers they already have ASIC customers in the networking space among U.S. companies, right? So I think they're already there, and I think that they have a good shot of extending that business because again, it's close to home, like you said, it's close to what they've already been doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think it's smart, right? It's early days. I mean, I think again, right? The when you hear the overall commentary, which is similar from others, they're just looking for areas where they can grow amidst other businesses that just aren't going to grow, right? So it makes sense to make these investments and see again what assets you have to bring to the table. Again, here in connectivity, right? They've evolved their modem strategy to a thin modem. So kind of similar to Qualcomm's, right? So if you need a thin modem and you don't need a full SoC, they're competitive there. The other interesting thing, to be honest with you, is I was a little bit surprised to find this out. I had a slight indication that they were at least a customer for TSMC 3 nanometer, but apparently they're actually going to be a top 5 customer priority for TSMC 3 nanometer because they have so much volume. Again, I don't know how much big of a deal 3 nanometer is going to be in some of these areas. It's probably smartphone first, but they are kind of on that early rise with TSMC that I think is going to be that. Well, I think that's interesting that they will be in the hunt with some of those first lead customers. Um, so whatever advantage that gives, right? They're getting some volume with TSMC on 3 nanometer, and that's going to start ramping. I think come next year.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a home field advantage there. If you go back to the history of MediaTek, they've always been very, very close to TSMC.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was big. It was a big thing in their early history, that relationship.
Yep.
And their MediaTek's headquarters is right across the Hsinchu from a bunch of TSMC fabs.
Yeah.
So that I think that helps. I mean, my guess is the same as yours. It's probably mobile phones first, but
Sure.
it pays to have good neighbors.
Absolutely. And I think TSMC did a lot of work with them when again they were kings in media codecs for DVD players, which was a great business for a long time at scale in consumer electronics. So good legacy and partnership. Um, so the only other category I wanted to mention, just because it's the category that likes to be bashed, was, they mentioned metaverse only because they're the design win in the PS5 VR, which again I don't expect to sell tremendous amounts of volumes, but that's actually a good design win. I don't know if it's semi-custom. No one would say, but I have to imagine they did some very specific optimization for PlayStation on that. So you kind of have, right, these two vendors, if we're just contrasting metaverse for Qualcomm and MediaTek in PSVR, Qualcomm in Oculus Quest. Again, not massive markets, but metaverse is there competing. It's not going to be an immediate growth area, but people are investing in it, so it's one of their other categories.
I'm tempted to. My urge is to boycott the whole subject, but if you think about it, if you go to the back halls of CES, less so this year, but certainly in the past, there are a lot of VR goggles out there
Yeah,
coming from Chinese companies, and so it's a natural fit. It's not a huge market, but it's
not a hit. Yeah,
we'll sell a few million units a year. It's a good place for them, right? And I think I would almost look at it like I think my take is VR is a small market. It'll be there, it'll be interesting, but the real interesting potential is with AR, when you have glasses that anybody can wear
yeah,
out in the world, and you can still see things, but you have that data overlay.
yep,
Maybe Apple's going
agreed.
to launch something soon on AR. Like, that's the
Yeah,
rumor, they're going to launch a
no,
$3,000 device.
yeah,
If that happens, when that happens, I assume they're going. Whenever that happens, everyone else is going to want to follow suit really quickly. And I think MediaTek wants to talk about XR or VR right now because just in case, 2 months from now, Apple launches its glasses, and suddenly everybody in the world wants to go out and build AR glasses. That's going to be a good business for MediaTek.
yeah, yep. Agreed. They don't talk a lot about their IoT business. I wish more of these companies, Qualcomm included, and others would talk about this more. But they did highlight it as a market opportunity. They view their slice of the pie of IoT as roughly a $30 billion dollar market, growing to 36 in 2027. Again, they're not going to get all of that, but they're like, this is the segment we think we can go after, which was, again, stuff we've talked about, right? Cameras, because they're in the Ring cameras, higher compute at the edge. But my point was, they view the market as very big categories in these adjacencies that they're going to start investing in. It takes time. They're not going to get all of it. But the good thing is, my takeaway was, these are really big markets. So it could support more competitors. It can support that, more getting a slice of a pie of these big, mega $1 billion markets. So it's smart to position that way. Again, everything comes down to execution, but I like that they're going after big markets. That's the point I'm making.
I think one thing that sort of stood out for me was in this. They talk a lot about IoT, and it's things they've been making for a long time. Wi-Fi for home
Yeah,
routers and
right.
connectivity in the home, that kind of stuff. But they actually have a couple slides dedicated to industrial. In particular, they announced a partnership with Kontron, which is a big
Contron,
IoT
yeah.
big IoT system company. I mean, that's actually fairly important. Like, to your point, that's a sizable market. It's a sizable higher margin market, lower volume, but it's pretty good pricing. Industrial IoT is going to be an important category. We're going to start to automate and digitize all the production factories in the world,
Yep.
and they're going after that. Like, and they're Kontron is probably a really good partner for them to have. So
Yeah.
they're
Yep.
moving down that path. It's pretty good.
Yeah. That's why they highlighted it. And again, right, this comes back to one of those things where they're doing a lot of work. They're in a lot of those interesting products. You just don't know, right? Because nobody talks about these design wins. So anyway, good business. All right. So the last thing, just because I want to encourage everybody to keep who cares, to keep an eye on this China auto market. So I've asked you this before, but now share it with the world. What are some of those brands that, if they wanted to start Googling or searching, like the Chinese brands that are to watch, that kind of make some of these cases that we're talking about?
So the big one is BYD, which was a big battery maker and now does electric vehicles as well. It's fairly well known. Warren Buffett had a big investment in. I think he still has a small stake, but Warren Buffett made a bunch of money on BYD. They're the market leader. Largely because they have a couple models that are very, very cheap and have been selling really well. Beyond that, the market is split in between the legacy ICE combustion engine makers, who are mostly state-run companies, Shanghai Automotive, Guangzhou Automotive, companies like that, that have subsidiary EV brands, which are doing very well because they have dealer networks and charging networks and all that stuff. And the other half of the market is a series of startups, their equivalent of Rivian. So there's Neo, Xpeng, Li Auto, who are much smaller in scale and are going through all the same sort of struggles that Rivian is going through, but tend to have higher priced luxury, SUVs, all kinds of different categories of cars. So that's very rough layout of the land.
Okay, cool. So everybody do some searching on that if you're not aware. Follow those brands to see what's happening, because this is again one of the more exciting spaces to watch as it relates to the semiconductor industry and content. So, all right, let's wrap there. And until next week, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for understanding.
All right, stopping recording.